Hey guys, today I just want to encourage you and to focus in on this topic of being alone. And so I searched for the definition of what does it mean to be alone, and from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says separated from others, isolated. It also says exclusive of anyone or anything else, considered without reference to any other. Solely, exclusively, without aid or support, incomparable, unique. So there's so many ways to be alone. But you can be socially alone, you can be by yourself alone, you can be in a social group and yet feel alone, feel distance from everyone else. And one of the things I just realized when being socially alone, not socially alone, physically alone from everyone else, is that you have all this brain space. So my family decided to go on a trip, so they're gone, and I have 5 days to myself, alone, with the dog, with the chickens. What do you do when you're alone? So first time they had left for just a few days, I at first started spending my time in prayer and just really working on my relationship with Christ, and that was amazing. Well, the next day I did not do so well, and I decided to start distracting myself. I decided to look to other things in this world. I sometimes watched YouTube. I had Facebook, just the different things that we distract ourselves with. And I also started talking to myself more, talking to the dog. Being alone makes you kind of do some weird things sometimes. But what I realized was there was a difference in the state of my soul between when I was talking with God during my aloneness versus when I decided to distract myself. And what you do in your time alone really can affect your relationship with the Lord. It's an interesting phenomenon. But as I'm on this time alone, I have also, even before being alone and now even being alone, I've been going through this journey of going through Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel, and watching these two people, one that was after God's own heart and one that decided to walk in rebellion to Christ. And we will tie this back to aloneness, but you can probably guess who I'm talking about. It was Saul versus David. And Saul was this man who was asked for by Israel. The Israelites are asking for a king, and Saul is chosen to lead this people, Israel. And so he's given this option. He can either lead well or he cannot lead well. So just like when you're alone, you can decide to go to Christ, or you can decide to distract yourself. You can decide to spend your time and fill your brain space with those things that are good, true, and noble in Christ, with His Word. Or you can distract yourself with with this world, the things of this world, with YouTube, Facebook, and those things aren't inherently wrong in and of themselves. It's what you choose to do with them. If you're choosing to let them distract you, that can be detrimental to your spiritual life, to your relationship with Christ. And so when Saul is anointed king and Samuel talks to the people of Israel, and some of the verses that just stood out to me, I'm just going to share. It's in 1 Samuel 12, starting in verse 20. It says, "Then Samuel said to the people, 'Do not fear. You have done all this wickedness, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And do not turn aside, for then you would go after empty things, which cannot profit or deliver, for they are nothing. For the Lord will not forsake His people for His great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you His people. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you. But I will teach you the good and right way. Only fear the Lord and serve Him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things He has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king.'" And this one really struck home for me because he says, look, you've sinned. And you know that. But God's giving you this other chance to walk in him, to obey him, and to not go after. He wants them to not go after these worthless things. For they are nothing. And just what God showed to me is just the things that I've been spending my time in watching YouTube, Facebook, they're nothing in light of who he is and what he wants for me. And so I was just encouraged anew to focus on Christ. Yes, I have sinned. I have distracted myself. I have not stayed disciplined. There's a list probably, and yet we have this option to run to Jesus. When we sin, we run to Jesus. We ask for forgiveness, and he is a forgiving Father. He is a good Father. He loves us. He will forgive us. But we must come to him in humility and meekness of heart and say, God, I've sinned. Will you forgive me? And then decide to walk in him. So going on further into Saul's kingdom, or Saul's reign, he decides to do a couple of things that are not the best decisions. First, he decided to offer a sacrifice without Samuel. He was supposed to wait for Samuel to offer the sacrifice. He waited 7 days, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and everyone scattered from him. Can you imagine? He's waiting for Samuel. He's supposed to be waiting for Samuel for the sacrifice, and the people are with him, and as time goes on, so are you really sure Samuel's gonna show up? He's not here yet. What are we doing here, Saul? And everyone scattered from him. And so Saul is just like, finally, he breaks down. He's like, bring me the burnt offering. I'm going to do this. So he does the sacrifice without Samuel. And so then Samuel shows up and says, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And so we see just this stripping away of the kingdom from Saul, because he decided to not wait on the Lord. Can you just think with me for a moment? Has there been a time when you just were like, I'm done waiting. I'm just going to go ahead and go for it. And what were the consequences of that action? There are consequences for our sins. And as we can see here, Saul received those consequences. Going on later in Samuel in chapter 15, he goes out into this army against, he goes out on this mission to kill the Amalekites. And he's supposed to kill everyone. He's not supposed to spare anyone, take anything for himself. He's supposed to kill everyone and come back to Samuel. Well, basically, like, he's going to report to Samuel that he's done this. And as the story goes, Saul spared the king, Agag, and they also took some of the women, some of their cattle, their sheep, and Samuel comes back and he's like, Saul, have you done what I commanded you? And he's like, what is this bleating of sheep that I hear? And basically, as the story goes, Samuel said, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king. For he has, or not Samuel said, this is what the Lord said. I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And this really struck me as it continued. It says in chapter 15, verse 10, and it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. And I just want to ask you, your sin grieve you? Or even does the sin of others grieve you? First, it starts with our sin. Does our sin grieve us? That we have sinned against Christ, that Christ is perfect, he is holy, he cannot live with sin. And yet we have sinned, we have fallen short. Does that sin that we have done grieve us? Well, it grieved Samuel, and he prayed and cried out to the Lord all night. I can't even imagine. So basically, as the story goes on, so I'm backtracking a little bit, but Saul comes back and he's like, I've done what you've commanded. I've done what the Lord has commanded. And Samuel's like, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul says, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord our God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And in verse 17, Samuel says, when you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And basically Saul comes back and he's like, but I did obey. Like, he's like, but the people, they took the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. So he's making this cause that the people have taken the sheep and oxen to make sacrifices to the Lord. And this is really the verse that really convicted me. It says in verse 22, so Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. And that just humbled me. And I was like, wow, my sin, your sin is so great. And it says in the song Living Hope by Phil Wickham, how great the chasm that lay between us, how high the mountain we could not climb. And to see the utter depravity we are in if we live in our sin. And that Saul, he was chosen out of the tribes of Israel to lead his people, Israel, God's people, Israel. And he tried to do it in his own strength, and he failed. The Lord rejected him as king. And so God raised up this other young man named David. Now, David grew up alone. I have to imagine he must have been lonely, caring for those sheep. He was a man who carried sheep, and he was anointed king. And then David goes and he fights Goliath, and man, I would have felt alone too. Like, you're the only people of all Israel, and but you believe in God, and you believe in the power of God over the voices of people, and he believed God over anything anyone else said. And so he with God's power in and through him, killed this man Goliath. And Saul continued, and Samuel continues to serve Saul, and Saul eventually decides to seek his life. And yet, the thing that David did over what Saul did was he sought the Lord. He decided to trust in the Lord over the circumstances of his life. And while these two men, they probably had very lonely times in their lives. They had two different decisions to make, and they took two different paths. And I want to ask you today, what path are you going to take? in this season, whatever season you're in the midst of COVID, in the midst of whether you feel lonely or you feel very well off, God has placed before us two options, that we can walk in obedience and surrender and humility before Him. Or we can decide, I waited, God, and I'm going to go on and do what I want. I've waited, God, and this is what I want to do. I waited, God, and everyone's scattered from me. Don't you see me, God, right here? Everyone has left me, and I am alone. And so bring me the offering. I'm going to do it myself. But God does delight in sacrifices over obedience. God wants obedience first. And so we're going to choose to obey God in this season. And what does that obedience look like? One of the verses I also looked into over this quarantine time was in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, and it's Solomon has just finished building the temple, and the Lord appears to him by night, and it's after Solomon has dedicated the temple. He's prayed to God, and God appears to him. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 12, it says, Then the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said to him, I have heard your prayer, and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Boy, does our land need healing right now. Are you willing to get on your knees before God and to pray, to seek His face, to turn from your wicked ways? He's given you a second chance, or maybe third, fourth, fifth chance. You know how many chances He's given you. But this still is relevant for us as it was then. If we seek His face, if we turn from our wicked ways, if we humble ourselves and seek His face and pray, He will hear from heaven, He will forgive our sin, and He will heal our land. Can I just encourage you afresh to just press into Jesus this week? To take whatever brain space you have, it may be a lot or it may be a little, and to decide to pray, to seek God's face, to walk in humility and obedience, and say, God, what do you have for me today? How do you want me to walk out in obedience to you today? And I truly believe He will reward you, as God has just helped me turn to Him during the season of being alone. It's just especially challenging to me because I don't like being alone. And yet, as I continue to pray, He continues to give me peace, and He continues to guide me and direct my steps. And it's such a blessing to, when I decide to seek the Lord, when I decide to pray and even to worship. There are times when I just decide to worship, and it's amazing how God shows in and shows up. He's a good, good Father. He gives good gifts to His children. And so I just want to leave you with the words of this song. It's called Give Me Jesus. You probably know it. But it says, in the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, give me Jesus. And the chorus goes, give me Jesus, give me Jesus, give me Jesus. You can have all this world, just give me Jesus. And then the next verse is, when I am alone, give me Jesus. The third verse is, when I come to die, give me Jesus. And the chorus is still the same. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all this world, and yet give me Jesus. Is that your prayer today? Or have you become so comfortable in this world that you would rather have the things of this world over Jesus. Our bodies were not meant to live forever. We're going to die sometime, whether it's from COVID, whether it's from cancer. These bodies are not eternal, and yet God is eternal. So let that be our prayer today, that you can have all this world. I just want Jesus. I just want Jesus. Be encouraged.